Imagine, through the morning mist rises a snow-white facade. Whitemarsh Hall, the American Versailles. Columns sparkle like a temple of ancient gods. French gardens, designed according to Versailles patterns, stretch beyond the horizon. This is not a house. This is a challenge. But now, shatter this picture. In the final years of its life, Whitemarsh Hall stood like the body of an abandoned empire. Shattered windows, torn copper, halls flooded with rain, marble soaked by time. The columns, not as decoration, but as tombstones to an era that America decided to forget. Because this house is not a symbol of a dream, it is a monument to greed, megalomania, and the illusions of the Gilded Age. And that is precisely why it was erased. But behind the ruins lies a question that won't let go. What did this house hide? Why was Pennsylvania's most grandiose private palace destroyed to its foundations? What was in its history so significant that they preferred not to rewrite it, but to bury it? Whitemarsh Hall is not just architecture. It is 6 floors of ambition, 3 underground levels, hundreds of rooms created not for living, but for power. And now it's time to say it directly. We see not a house, we see a facade. And behind it, financial deals, political games, compromises, and the psychological cost of immortality, for which the owners paid with their lives. This story is not in books, not in tours, and not in museums. This is a path into the forbidden zone, and you have already stepped onto it. Subscribe if you want to know what great houses hide. It will only go deeper from here. If you want to understand the tragedy of Whitemarsh Hall, don't start with blueprints, not with marble, not with Edward Stotesbury's biography. Start with the land. Imagine Pennsylvania in the 1910s. Not the noisy streets of Philadelphia, not the luxury of salons, but endless rural hills spanning 300 acres. No paths, no balustrades, no fountains. Only fields, wind, and the laws of nature, dictated here not by architecture, but by raw, stubborn earth. In spring, mud clings here up to the ankle. Downpours soften the slopes, rain doesn't stop for weeks. Water penetrates into the very clay and pulls down everything that tries to stand vertically. In autumn, fog, so thick that the outlines of trees disappear, and day merges with night. And in winter, icy winds tear bark from trees like skin and howl across the slopes like a warning. This land is not for people who want the eternal. This was not a place for a palace. Neither farmsteads nor factories nor ancient estates stood here. Here was emptiness, natural, harsh, unyielding. Land that did not ask to be transformed into an arena of power. But it was precisely here, despite everything, that Edward Stotesbury's gaze was directed. Why does a man who could afford any plot in Newport, on Long Island, in the Hudson Valley, choose this remote, wild place where even nature says no? The answer is not in logic, and not in beauty. The answer is in intention. Because power, like architecture, manifests not where it's easy, but where it's impossible. To build something grandiose on already developed land means simply to decorate success. But to raise an imperial palace where even the forest doesn't put down roots deeper than a meter, this is already an act of conquest. This is a statement. I am stronger than climate, time, and the soil itself. From the very beginning, Whitemarsh Hall was built not with nature, but against it. It didn't follow the lines of the hills, it erased them. It didn't fit the contour, it drew a new one. The land resisted, but money, hundreds of times more than was needed for an ordinary house, bent under this resistance, like an excavator bucket. Water was pumped out, slopes were reinforced, soil was leveled and compacted, forests were cleared, retaining walls were erected, and all this so that on this inhospitable, rain-soaked slope would appear a symbol that was meant to outlive its master. And here is the first crack. Because when a building rises not at the call of place, but in deaf opposition to it, its foundation already carries within itself tension. This conflict between environment and ambition becomes not an architectural task, but a philosophical diagnosis. There should not have been a palace here, but it appeared, like a scar, like the embodied will of one man, a man who decided that money could defeat nature. And at this moment, history doesn't yet know that he was wrong. But the land already knew. It's impossible to understand why Whitemarsh Hall was born precisely as it was: grandiose, pretentious, inadequate even by the most generous standards of luxury, without understanding the source of its blood: money. But not just wealth, not simple banking profit, but money infused with politics, manipulations, and compromises. Money that didn't flow from top to bottom, like a waterfall of success, but seeped from below, from beneath the heavy, almost dark layers of the golden age of American capital, an era where behind every fortune stood deals that newspapers didn't write about. Edward Stotesbury was not simply a rich man, he was the shadow of J.P. Morgan, the unofficial finance minister of private America. He knew where the keys to trillions lay. He participated in mergers that redrew the banking map of the East Coast. He sat at tables where questions weren't asked, because everyone present already knew the price of silence. He didn't earn money, he managed flows. He could in one night decide the fate of a railroad company or close a factory that textbooks wrote about. His power wasn't visible to the public, but it was felt in every movement of the economic scene. It was precisely this money that became the foundation of Whitemarsh Hall. This was not a gesture of love, this was not a wedding gift, and it wasn't even a dream house. This was a monument, not to architecture, but to superiority. Edward wasn't simply building housing. He was erecting a symbol that was meant to prove, to those who shared Morgan's table with him, to those who spoke of him behind his back as a provincial who married a widow with children, that his power was absolute, that he could build a temple equal to Biltmore, Oheka, and Linwood, and even surpass them. But behind this gesture lies compromise, not internal, not philosophical, but literal. Every stone, every cornice, every column was paid for with capital obtained through complex, often semi-shadowy schemes. Banking mergers where hundreds were laid off, credit lines that displaced competitors, backroom negotiations where rules were established for entire industries, money that could sound beautiful on paper, but in reality smelled of other people's sweat and fear. Therefore, Whitemarsh Hall, from the very beginning, was not a home, but a statement. It wasn't built because it could, it was built because it had to be. Stotesbury wasn't seeking solitude, wasn't dreaming of rural idle. He was creating an arena, a stone declaration of power, behind which stood the entire weight of compromises made in the silence of conference rooms. This was an act of strength, but also an act of vulnerability, because he who builds for proof has already put himself in a position where proof is needed. And this compromise, between demonstration of power and fear of being forgotten, soaked into every inch of the palace, like a shadow that isn't visible in daylight, but is always nearby. On the surface, everything looked simple: a hill, silence, fresh air, space for gardens and terraces, a view of the county that seemed to ask for a canvas. People unfamiliar with the logic of power might think that the place for Whitemarsh Hall was chosen for beauty, for the poetry of nature, for a landscape that easily fit into the idea of a palace, like a frame for a picturesque portrait. But this would be a deep mistake. Because in reality, the choice of location had nothing to do with aesthetics. It was strategic, calculated to the inch, to the horizon line, and every element that looked natural was intentional. Every line on the map, every turn of the road, every elevation, were part of an architectural game that Stotesbury entered not for a house, but for position. From the hilltop, Whitemarsh Hall looked down on the county. It didn't simply stand higher, it dominated. This was a throne, not an estate. From this ledge one could see everything: roads, villages, neighboring lands. And this was not a coincidence. This was a choice made in favor of observation, control, symbolic domination over space that was meant not so much to belong as to submit. But even deeper, a motive that was never spoken aloud but determined everything: social competition. While the Vanderbilts, DuPonts, Goulds, and Huntingtons were building their castles from Long Island to North Carolina, Stotesbury understood that the very existence of his house must be a challenge, a response to a challenge, a blow to the hierarchy. His palace had to outshout Linwood Hall, overshadow Biltmore, put even Ohika Castle in the shade. This was not an aesthetic competition. This was a battle for symbolic primacy. Who would build a house that could not be ignored? And finally, financial calculation. The land on which the future palace stood was undervalued. Rural, unremarkable, it cost little. But with the appearance of Whitemarsh Hall, everything changed. Prices for neighboring plots rose. A slow but steady growth of elite residential construction began. Rising demand, revaluation of assets. The house became not just architecture, it became a market instrument, part of an investment strategy. The palace as a catalyst for capital growth. That's why the choice of location was not an act of inspiration, it was an act of calculation, and therefore it was infected from the very beginning. Cynicism, inscribed in the land, poisoned the idea of home from the first stone. Because a house built not for life, but for position, carries tension within itself from day one. It doesn't grow from place, it cuts into it. And like any violence against environment, it leaves a trace. Sometimes, not immediately, but always, inevitably. If any great palace has a heart, then Whitemarsh Hall's beat in the blueprints of Horace Trumbauer, a phantom architect, a man whose name rarely sounds in popular books, but whose buildings still stand as silent manifestos of his era's ambitions. He was not a press favorite. He was not an eloquent genius shining in salons. He didn't write treatises. He built, silently, maniacally, with the precision of a surgeon and the passion of a romantic hidden behind stone facades. Trumbauer grew up without family capital, without a noble name, without European academies. He was the son of a merchant, self-taught, a man whose obsession with architecture developed not in auditoriums, but on the streets of Philadelphia, among brick facades and warehouse arches. But it was precisely in this harsh environment that a special sensitivity was forged in him, the ability to feel scale, to see a building as an organism, not as a facade. He didn't draw, he composed, and each of his buildings became part of an unexpressed but recognizable symphony about power, about time, about eternity. When Stotesbury offered him a project that didn't yet exist in America, Trumbauer understood immediately. This was his chance, not just to build a house, but to leave a statement, to outpace Ohika, surpass Biltmore, turn American architecture into a ritual of power as mighty as Europe's palaces. He didn't hesitate. He seized the project like predestination and began to work as if his immortality depended on it. Plans grew with each month, rooms multiplied, proportions lengthened. He didn't restrain himself. Halls as high as theaters, staircases as wide as streets, columns that stood not for function but for gesture. The house was designed not for convenience, but for effect. Balconies that led nowhere, galleries that repeated Versailles motifs, a central portico like a temple. Everything was hyperbole, but not chaotic. Every line obeyed a sense of rhythm that was in his blood. He wasn't building a private residence, he was building a symbol. But along with genius came shadow. Trumbauer was not just obsessed, he was destructively obsessed. He tore up plans, redid sketches at night, didn't tolerate objections. His workers feared his silence more than shouting. He looked at the project as a body that had no right to be sick. Every mistake, every attempt to simplify, was perceived as betrayal. He lived inside these walls even before they were raised, and this exhausted everything around. But it was precisely this fanaticism that made Whitemarsh Hall not just big, but truly frightening in its scale. It became not a house, but a totem of architectural pride, and in every hall, in every frieze, in every capital, vibrated the obsession of a man who wanted to defeat death with stone, symmetry, and silence. Trumbauer left no memoirs, but he left this house, and the house speaks for him. When the blueprints for Whitemarsh Hall first landed on the commission's table, they didn't evoke admiration. They evoked stupor. The architectural community, accustomed to scale, to audacity, to the theatrical luxury of the Gilded Age, nevertheless involuntarily recoiled. So grandiose, so irrational was the proposed volume. This was not a house, not an estate, not a country residence. This was something that by all signs wanted to become a monarchy. Stone, enclosed, immobile. 147 rooms, 3 underground levels, its own power plant, telephone station, cinema, Roman pool built into the heating system, ballroom for 800 people, a room just for cookies, cookie room, designated in plans seriously, not as a curiosity. 45 bathrooms, 20 lawnmowers with a separate garage, 70 gardeners, and as many permanent servants. A wine cellar that stored alcohol even during Prohibition, as a demonstrative disregard for rules written for others. Every number didn't just astound, it mocked reality. The plan looked like an architectural myth descended from heaven, but forgetting that on Earth there is gravity, budgets, materials, climate, the human factor. Inside the document there was not a single concession, not to logistics, not to fatigue, not to time. This was architecture of total denial of limitation. And in this was truth. Because Whitemarsh Hall was not built in dialogue with life. It was built against it. No family, even with a fortune of hundreds of millions, could rationally maintain such an organism. It was voracious, like an empire, fragile, like crystal, dependent on an endless chain of workers, supplies, electricity, steam, insulation, pressure, cleanliness. Any stoppage in the system, and an entire floor froze, corridors darkened, boilers began to rust. The house demanded not just attention, it demanded worship. And yet, this is precisely what was laid into the plans. Worship. Inside every line, every blueprint sounded the same thought. We will build something that will stand 1,000 years. That will outlive economic cycles, political regimes, biographies. That will become not a house, but a tomb of eternal ambition. But in this was the crack. Because Whitemarsh Hall was built as if it would never have to be closed, heated, saved from time. As if it were enough to approve the blueprint once, and everything else would already become eternal. But there is no eternity in a house into which the impossibility of living is sown from the first days. And therefore, already at the moment of plan approval, the house began to collapse. Not physically, but conceptually. It became that which cannot be executed without sacrifices. And these sacrifices were only beginning. The conflict began immediately. It was inevitable. Because Trumbauer's blueprints, falling into the hands of local officials of Springfield County, were not perceived as a private house project, they were perceived as a threat, as a challenge, as architectural rebellion against norms, sizes, common sense, and everything that the county was accustomed to considering acceptable. Too high, too wide, too expensive, too monumental. Corridors resembled museum galleries. Staircases looked like grand descents into opera houses. Columns by weight and volume could rival bank facades. Foundations went too deep. The ventilation system seemed excessive. Water supply, exorbitant. And officials, accustomed to approving mansion projects, suddenly found themselves face to face with a plan that more resembled theatrical empire infrastructure than a house for a family. Fear didn't come from size. Fear came from subtext, because behind every "to" stood the same thing. We'll do as we want, and you can't stop us. And in this was what frightens the system most of all: independence multiplied by money. Resistance began, slow, viscous, couched in the language of inspections and instructions. Galleries were suggested to narrow, columns to lighten, building wings to simplify. Change requests were submitted as recommendations, but behind them hid threats. If you don't reduce the scale, the project will be delayed, licenses reconsidered, work stopped. Trumbauer was furious. He, accustomed to drawing for the Morgans, Drexels, and Huntingtons, didn't tolerate being told how to properly stack stones. He recognized no authorities except architectural logic, of which he himself was the author, and therefore every correction was perceived by him as a blow. He argued, reworked, resisted. But officials were stubborn, not because they believed in norms, but because they envied. Envy was old, deep, at the level of social memory. Someone who was never part of Springfield's elite, who appeared from somewhere, was now building a structure that would overshadow everything that had stood here for centuries. And this feeling that someone is doing something too beautifully, too loudly, too proudly, becomes a source of tacit sabotage. Documents get lost, permits are delayed, inspections are scheduled suddenly, building codes begin to be interpreted flexibly, but not in favor of the project. Changes are made without approvals, individual blueprints require re-evaluation, and the entire process, instead of progressive forward movement, begins to resemble a siege. Trumbauer doesn't retreat. He demands compliance with the author's vision, but every delay hits the budget, every missed deadline, reputation, every conceded requirement, his inner world. And in this lies the tragedy. Because Whitemarsh Hall from the first days was not a place of harmony, but an arena of conflict, between individual obsession and public resistance, between genius and fear of genius, between an architect who built for eternity and a system that lived by days. And it was precisely this tension that soaked into the building from the very first stone. When, after months of resistance and delays, the Whitemarsh Hall project was finally officially approved, press releases spoke of it as a triumph of architectural dialogue. They spoke of competition, of public hearings, of the Commission's careful work. They said that the best project won, scaled, refined, elegant. They said that Trumbauer managed to find balance between ambition and local requirements. Everything looked smooth. But reality, as always, was a different scenario. Because in reality, the project that won was not the one most aesthetically perfect, and not the one most economically reasonable. The one that proved most profitable for everyone except architecture itself won. Compromise was reached not in the meeting hall, it was forged in the kitchens of politics, in side offices where contractors gathered, county representatives, Stotesbury family trustees, and those who knew the price of every sub-item of the city budget. And the decision to approve the project became not aesthetic, but transactional. Stotesbury promised to invest in roads. He committed to expand communications, repair a section of highway, build a water tower. In response, the municipality closed its eyes to the scale of the foundation, to area overruns, to height exceedances. The district understood. A palace of this level would attract attention, increase the tax base, raise prestige, attract new landowners. Rural Springfield could transform into elite territory, and all this without votes, without reforms, without strategies. Simply at the expense of one house. Contractors from the county, previously displaced by more powerful players from New York and Philadelphia, received their shares. Contracts were transferred quietly. Terms were signed without unnecessary noise. Inside, the project was already being distributed as a field of interests, concrete to one, windows to another, tiles to a third. Architecture became an arena of deals. And Trumbauer, not a conductor, but a hostage of a system in which too many had their share in final beauty. Some of his original sketches were rejected without explanation. Some trimmed beyond recognition. Details in which he insisted on line purity were replaced with more cheap analogs because the estimate required it. Rumors of informal meetings between officials and construction intermediaries multiplied. Architecture yielded to interests, and the house facade that was meant to be a manifesto became packaging, carefully regulated, coordinated, sanctioned by the system. And here in this final decision, when everything was supposedly agreed upon, when it seemed the plan was approved and work was about to begin, a second, much deeper conflict was laid. A building that was meant to be an expression of genius began to be built as a compromise convenient to everyone except the house itself. Among architectural titans, banking clans, backroom deals, and million-dollar contracts, this man's figure looked almost accidental. He didn't belong to Philadelphia, nor New York, nor industrialist clubs, nor architect guilds. His name wasn't listed among recommended masters. He didn't participate in competitions, wasn't published in journals, and nevertheless, it was he who found himself at the origin of Whitemarsh Hall's construction, a project that, by all laws of the era, should have been inaccessible to people like him. He was called simply. His biography didn't evoke headlines. He was born in these parts, among those very hills that were later leveled for the foundation of the future palace. His hands knew this land, not from maps, but from touch. He built churches, repaired barns, raised, simple farmhouses, stone by stone. Didn't chase fame, and probably would have remained in shadow if not for a chain of coincidences, refusals, delays, and ambitions that at some point brought him to the threshold of the state's greatest architectural project. Trumbauer noticed him not through recommendations, but through the voice of stone. He heard how he worked, saw how he laid walls, not by rule, but by feeling, with respect, not as material, but as a living body. The architect needed not just a mason, he needed a mediator between his blueprints and the nature they were meant to subdue. And in this local master, he saw something more than technique. He saw silence, that rare, deep concentration that cannot be taught, only recognized. But the choice was not obvious. Contractors resisted. Financiers suggested real specialists. Commissions asked questions. How could a man without licenses, without a name, without contracts for large objects, enter a construction site where the count went into millions? But Eva Stotesbury intervened. She, unlike her husband, sensed people's energy, not papers, and she felt that this man seemed to belong to this land, and therefore could reconcile it with what was being erected on it. He was accepted, almost accidentally, almost formally. In the estimate, his name stood at the bottom, almost imperceptibly. But it was with his hands that the first bearing wall was laid. It was he who reinforced the slope that everyone refused. It was he who worked on days when equipment stopped, when blueprints lost meaning, when the structure cracked from temperature changes. He made no statements. He simply built, as if everything he'd done before was preparation for this one project. And in this lies special tragedy. Because this man was the only one who didn't come for profit, didn't seek prestige, didn't strive to enter history, but it was he, nameless, speechless, who put into Whitemarsh Hall what neither architecture nor capital lacked: respect for the land. His story is short. After completing the construction phase, he disappeared from records, received neither title nor award nor thanks. But he remained in the house, in the masonry, in the foundation, in the feeling that at least someone in this project heard not only the noise of money, but also the breath of soil. When people talk about the construction of Whitemarsh Hall, they love to list meters, budgets, styles, architectural sources, but almost no one talks about pain, about real physical pain, about those bodies that soaked into this construction like lime into wet stone. Because behind every 100,000 square feet here stood not principles of beauty, but broken backs, frozen fingers, blinded eyes. And this pain was not accidental, it was part of the price. Construction lasted 5 years, not in seasons, not in stages, but like one prolonged battle without respite. The house demanded pace, the architect demanded precision, the client demanded deadlines, and therefore work went on in any weather, day and night, in heat and snow, in fog and mud, in smoke from boilers, in the hum of generators. This was not a process. This was a siege. In summer, underground levels turned into steam chambers. Humidity reached its limit. Clay stuck to clothes like cement. There wasn't enough air. There was no ventilation yet. People lost consciousness, got up, continued, worked bare-chested, with covered faces to at least slightly ease the suffocation of lime dust and heat. Staircases fell out of rhythm, mechanisms broke. Stone, not dried, began to float. And then everything had to be redone. Again and again. In winter, the situation became dangerous. Frost seized the mortar. Stone cracked. Slopes, barely reinforced, became icy. People fell down. Hands lost sensitivity. They had to work in gloves that immediately soaked with water and froze. The roof stood without protection. Inside it blew, inside it froze. Fireplaces were unfinished, stoves temporary, and schedules iron. No one canceled shifts. At night, work didn't stop. Lighting was poor. Generators hummed, but their power wasn't enough. Shadows walked through unfinished corridors. People slept right at the site, in barracks, without heating. Food was meager. No one spent on comfort. It was important not to fall behind. Trumbauer monitored every pouring, every cornice line. He tore up blueprints if a detail seemed imperfect to him. He broke what was already done. He called the crew at night to redo a hall. His fanaticism became an integral part of the atmosphere. People didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but they knew it would be worse. There were injuries, silently documented, described by no one. One worker died when scaffolding collapsed. Another went blind after a boiler explosion. Several were taken away with fractures. Someone disappeared. Someone left. Someone stayed because there was nowhere else. These stories didn't make it into reports. They weren't photographed, not described in letters, but they were there. They were in cracks of stones, in stains on concrete slabs, in faded contractor records, in dry medical reports that weren't open publicly. And therefore, when today someone admires the grandeur of Whitemarsh Hall in old photographs, they should know the beauty of this facade costs more than gold. It was paid for with sweat, pain, and fear of those whose names remained in concrete silence. In the official history of Whitemarsh Hall, much is written with grandeur. Plans, architecture, names, style, staircases, balustrades, fountains, French chandeliers, Italian marble, English parquet, everything, as in a nation's palace chronicle that loved to look up but rarely down. And it was precisely there, down below, under all this stone and gilding, that the truth remained that no one recorded, because no one wanted to remember. The truth about those who built. Not Trumbauer, not Stotesbury, not engineers and not contractors whose names made it into estimates and archives, but others, those who weren't named, those who weren't welcomed at balls, those who worked but weren't present, immigrants, laborers, seasonal masons hired a day before the shift, men without documents, without protection rights, without the ability to complain, people from Ireland, Poland, Italy, from the South and depressed areas of Pennsylvania. They were hired through intermediaries, paid minimum, settled in barracks, fed leftovers. They disappeared as quickly as they appeared, and no one asked questions. They didn't build halls. They raised walls along which tours were later conducted. They didn't know who owned this house, and it didn't matter. They worked without days off, without insurance, without basic protection, slept on boards, were silent when they fell from the second level, tied fingers with bandages and went on, because otherwise, not a cent. No food, no chance. Drafts carried their coughs into concrete, dust burned eyes, mortar corroded skin. Someone lost hearing, someone's sight, someone simply disappeared, sometimes forever, sometimes just in the archive. Photographers didn't shoot them. Their faces didn't make it onto house posters. They aren't mentioned in architecture books. And perhaps that's precisely why the house turned out so alien, because it was built by the hands of people whose existence history preferred to forget. Today numbers are preserved. 70 gardeners, 70 servants. Fine, this is the facade. But the real workforce, nameless, tongueless, voiceless, lived in shadow, in passages, in mud. They created magnificence into which they weren't admitted. Their presence was conditional, their labor invisible. And it's precisely in this that lies the palace's moral failure. Because no marble staircase can hide the fact that its supporting beams stand on the backs of people to whom no one ever said thank you. And when the house collapses, and archives burn, and walls crumble, only one truth will remain untouched. Whitemarsh Hall was built on injustice, polished to a shine. When the last scaffolding was removed, when gardeners leveled the lawns, when ceiling gilding shone in evening light, the moment arrived that had been awaited for 5 years. The Stotesbury family was to enter their new home. Officially, triumph. Unofficially, the first crack in the illusion. Because Whitemarsh Hall, despite luxury, despite precision of execution, despite millions invested in every cornice, turned out to be empty. Not in the sense of furniture, it was furnished. Not in the sense of space, the halls were colossal. Empty in another way, in feeling. It didn't accept its own. From the first steps, from the first echo of steps on marble, it became clear this house was alien even to those who ordered it. Halls were cold. Stoves couldn't handle ceiling height. Corridors responded with echoes despite carpets. Staircases creaked as if complaining. Hundreds of rooms didn't await guests, they awaited meaning. But there was none. Rooms for servants, storage rooms, technical corridors created the feeling not of a home, but of a theater where rehearsal dragged on forever. Mechanisms hummed like in a factory. Electricity buzzed as if reminding, everything is held by artificial tension. Eva Stotesbury tried to breathe life into the house. Invited musicians, organized balls, ordered an organ that was installed in the central gallery, decorated walls with fabrics, placed live flowers, brought fragrances. But all this disappeared into space, as if the house extinguished revival attempts, as if it accepted every candle flame as audacity, as violation of the silence it itself created. Edward felt this more strongly than anyone. He was a man of calculation. He knew numbers, and when calculations showed that house maintenance cost $1 million a year, he understood. The organism had gone out of control. Engineers came every day. Servants couldn't cope. Mechanisms broke. Gardens drowned in precipitation. Repairs began before finishing was complete. The house consumed itself. Walls molded. Moisture penetrated plaster. No one signed acceptance certificates. Everyone understood. Construction wasn't finished. It simply froze. But there was something deeper. The feeling that the house resisted. Not technically, energetically. It didn't want to be housing. It wasn't built for life. It was built for ambition. And when living people entered inside, they turned out to be superfluous, unnecessary, interfering with geometry. It was precisely this that made Whitemarsh Hall one of the most paradoxical projects in history. A house into which no one truly moved. A house that never became a home. The Stotesburys lived in it as temporary guests. Servants feared corners. Guests left early. Even dogs, they say, howled at night. And therefore the first tenant turned out to be not a person, but emptiness. Emptiness that was impossible to fill with gold, nor marble, nor light. In 1929, when New York exchanges began to crack like wooden beams under the weight of rain, when stock pages filled with names of bankrupt corporations and the line to banks became longer than to theaters, Whitemarsh Hall already stood, like a fortress of illusions. It sparkled with domes, glimmered with lanterns, its gardeners still trimmed the lawn by ruler, and inside halls prepared for a ball. It seemed the house was outside time, outside economic cycles, outside catastrophes. This was a lie. The Great Depression didn't crash down on the palace immediately. First it came softly, with refusals of receptions, with cancellation of bills, with dismissal of some servants. Then, a bit louder, some gardeners left, the roof began to leak. Phones in the winter wing were no longer repaired. Then, with a blow, of Stotesbury's fortune, once exceeding $100 million, less than 4 remained. And every day of cuts turned the palace into an archive of the past, still living. Edward died slowly, not only as a person, but as an idea. His power disappeared. His name no longer appeared in business circles, and the house that was meant to be a monument of greatness became a burden. It no longer worked for status. It demanded salvation. $1 million a year for maintenance became impossible, and everything went awry. After Edward's death, the house emptied, partially sold off. Collections moved to museums. The organ fell silent. Halls stood in darkness. Drafts ran through stone galleries. Family remnants tried to maintain the facade of decency, but everything was collapsing. Then, another transformation. During World War II, the palace temporarily became a metropolitan museum warehouse, not by status, by necessity. Then, laboratories of a chemical company using the basements. Then, vandals. Copper from the roof was cut at night. Staircases were broken step by step. Cornices were knocked off with crowbars. Windows were smashed. And rain, that same spring, heavy rain that had once been the enemy of primary earth, became the enemy of marble. It seeped into walls. It destroyed seams. It did what crises, taxes, death couldn't do. The finale was soundless. No storm, no fire, just gradual disappearance. Years of oblivion, press silence, discussions at municipality level, and in 1980, just 5 decades after the Stotesbury family's triumphant entry into the Central Gallery, Whitemarsh Hall was demolished. Didn't burn, didn't collapse, was destroyed, as if it had never existed. Today, only 4 columns remain of Whitemarsh Hall. They're called Ghosts of Versailles. They stand, surrounded by grass and townhouses, as a reminder of something impossible, too big, too expensive, too proud to survive. People come, take photos, read plaques, sometimes ask, "What was here?" and receive in answer, "A house, one of the largest in America, built and destroyed within the limits of 1 century." But behind this phrase lies a lie, or at least half the truth. Because Whitemarsh Hall wasn't just a house, it was a mirror. It was the crystallized form of an idea that America believed in and then fled from. It was a monument to an era where luxury was considered justification, where power was measured by cornices and immortality by gallery length. It was a capsule of hope that one could buy eternity, and simultaneously, the curse of this hope. America destroyed this house not because it deteriorated, but because it became inconvenient. As a reminder, as a question, as a symbol of the defeat of a dream built on ignoring reality. This house was too beautiful to be honest, too ambitious to be useful, too detached from life to be alive. It said, "You can have everything," and then fell silent when it turned out that everything doesn't save from time, from finances, from loneliness, from emptiness in halls where even echo sounds uncertain. We love facades, we love luxury, we love the promise of eternity, but Whitemarsh Hall shows all this disappears, faster than it seems, and only the question remains, why? For what? For whom? 4 columns, 1 park, emptiness in place of the ballroom, and perhaps most importantly, memory. Because the fates invested in this house, of workers, architects, owners, servants, musicians, children, didn't disappear. They dissolved into American soil. And if today someone again wants to build something equally grandiose, they should come here, to Springfield, stand at these columns, and listen to the silence. Silence will say more than any architecture books. It will say the truth.